Is this an attempt, just a naked attempt, to delegitimise the entire, never mind the curriculum, but everything that
Yeah.
Britain has ever stood for?
And indeed the West in general. I mean, that's the intention. I mean, that extraordinary.
You were discussing the Black Lives Matter activist, and this was in relation to a certain incident where you dedicate 2 paragraphs to it, indeed, where a group of lads who it appears were in the household's cavalry, and they were appalled at the mess and desecration left behind by these activists. So they turned up with bin bags, water, detergent and scrubbing brushes and began the great clear-up. Now, they were accosted during doing so, during this great clean-up, by this young white woman for daring to do so, for having the temerity to start scrubbing a national monument in this country that had been desecrated by these activists. I've got 2 questions on that. Could you just, first of all, tell us what you think this says about the brand of activism of these Black Lives Matter activists? And secondly, does the actions of these altruistic young men give you hope for the future?
What does it tell us? Well, you've given a very good picture of the incident itself, but you've left out the most important thing, which is what the young woman sounded like. She had a slightly abrasive, whiny, whinny, aggrieved upper-class voice, and it came over something like this. What? You couldn't even lead for a day, not a single day, you and your precious monuments. And the lads were very polite. They just ignored her. They continued working. And of course, she's then very, very aggrieved at being ignored. So what does she do? Have you ever been... come, Darren, from your rural fastness in Battersea, have you ever been to Harrods? You will know there's a certain kind of woman who shops at Harrods, and if they're not getting instant, prompt attention, you get, excuse me, and that was the voice, and it was the voice of entitled, privileged, needless to say. She's at Chelsea College. Needless to say, she's reading fine arts. Needless to say, she is wanting a career in, my dear, film design and set. Here are the lads in the household cavalry. Sensible, straightforward, shocked. I mean, after all, what are these precious monuments? Somebody has just tried to set fire to the Union Jack on the Senator. Let's just say that again. To set fire to the monument of the millions of dead, white, black, Indian, who fought for freedom in 2 world wars. They've deliberately sought out the national flag. Right? Your precious monuments, excuse me. I think it tells you everything. It tells you about the white support. It tells, because of course that's a very important part of Black Lives, these are the people who work themselves up into a lather about leaving the European Union, about vote leave. These are the people who tie themselves in knots about, despite the fact, of course, they usually have lots of money, live in big houses, drive big cars. They get wildly excited about extinction. It's a class. It's pure class. It's a form of upper class, middle class, arrogant patronage of those who are the less educated, didn't go to university, didn't read social sciences, and the poor working sons of toil, from whom I happen to come, despite the fact that it's rather well disguised.
Dr. Starkey, can I ask you a question about, you mentioned your background there for a second. If we focus on your background, and I just give you a brief overview of my own, I've got 2 brothers back home in County Durham, both younger than I am, both victims of the COVID crisis, both the grandsons of a miner, both from fatherless homes, both in and out of precarious work. And I look at both of them and I think, where is your white privilege? Where is your evidence of white privilege that these middle class activists want to try and suggest that you have. Now, when we think about your background and your hard work and determination is what has got you to your success in life, that wasn't from any white privilege, was it?
No, it wasn't. Now, Darren, this is a really important point. I have just corrected a biography that somebody is publishing for an event that I'm doing, which is taken from the Waterstones website. And what I said to them was, I really don't like this because it's got a tone of whiny victimhood about it. I mean, if I wanted to play the game of dear me, I'm a victim too, it would be very easy for me to do it. Mm-hmm. My father left school. I'm obviously old, so my parents go back to, they were both born in 1907. My father left school part-time at the age of 11. He left school full-time at the age of 13. He was a barber's boy before he left. His own father died when he was 11. His mother had died in infancy. He is brought up by a stepmother. On the day that he completed his apprenticeship in September 1928, he is sacked from Platt Brothers, the engineering firm that made cotton machinery. He is then unemployed for 7 years, and in a state of such desperate poverty that when he was diagnosed with this imaginary disease called porphyria, which we now deal with by cleaning between our teeth and get bleeding gums, then it was yet another imaginary disease, I think a bit like COVID, and the dentist recommended you had all your teeth out. He did. And to save 2 6pence, 12.5 pence, he had them out without anaesthetic. The upper jaw on one day and the lower jaw the next. Right, that's my background. And I rage. I simply become, I'm not normally incoherent, but I become incoherent with rage when some privileged little prat like a Laura Penny or the rest of them ventures to challenge me on those grounds.
What is the scholarship behind this movement, though? Because if you consider the fact that I think this country is quite unique in Europe for the fact that it enjoys incredibly good, at least for now, until these activists and a left-wing media tries to stir up, I think, I would go as far as saying hatred between communities. But we have fantastic race relations. We are one of the most richly diverse countries in the world, especially London. And that seems to work, for the most part, I think, pretty well. So what do you think explains the scholarship, the thinking behind this, for this entire movement to actually be imported from the United States of America to our shores?
Well, I think there is, I mean, you summarized it brilliantly. I think that one of the great problems was that West Indian blacks in Britain arrived, the famous Windrush and whatever, they arrived with a singular culture of their own, very Christian, evangelical, participatory, and all the rest of it. But that is somehow, and I'm not quite sure why or how, because, let me be honest, I am no expert in this, but it seems to have got lost. And instead, blacks in Britain, certainly the politically active of them, have tended to borrow from America, and they borrow from America both in as it were formal politics, but also lifestyle, dress, music, the whole gangster culture, the putting of slavery central into the picture, completely ignoring the fact, of course, that we had our debate. Everybody says, isn't it time Britain had its debate on slavery? We tore ourselves apart over slavery from the 1760s to the 1830s. We had this gigantic debate, which finally culminated in the abolition of slavery, not only in Britain, but in the Empire, and using the might of the British Navy, then the equivalent of all other navies in the world put together to wipe out the slave trade universally. But that's, that is, what is it? It's 100 and coming up to 200 years ago, and 190 years ago. very, very firmly in the past. But what's happened is, as I said, that black culture has been, at every level, musically, politically, whatever, has been the direct importation of what I think is the worst side of American black culture. We began by talking about victimhood. Blacks in America were faced with that great choice. They're faced with Martin Luther King, which is black pride, which is black courage, which is character and all of that. They by and large rejected that, and instead they've gone for Al Sharpton. They've gone for violence and victimhood, and I'm afraid that's what we are actually seeing in the Black Lives Matter, which is the fusion of that what seems to me to be a profoundly destructive and nihilistic creed. I mean, it's deeply, again, Darren, what renders me again speechless about this is the principal victims of it are young black men. Young black men are not killed by the police in Britain. There hasn't been one, I think, in 3 years. Few whites have been killed by the police, and several have died in custody, usually because of drugs. But the people who kill young black men are other young black men in terrifyingly large numbers. Black lives only matter politically when it's a white who takes them or an honorary white who is a policeman. A black life taken by a black has got absolutely no political significance at all and is never talked about. And we've had these incidents interspersing the generations in London, in which you have seen, black on black violence, or you have actually seen what I also care about profoundly, which is a Muslim or Kurdish immigrant on gays. All of those things completely set aside. Because what we have now is not a genuine concern about racial advancement or whatever racial justice means. It's the use of, as it were, black as a kind of insulating tape around which you can wrap all sorts of dangerous ideas. I think it's really very symbolic that our wonderful, Formula One champion, that man, that passionate believer in human rights and in education, and we're so keen to advance them in his native country, whose flag he repeatedly drapes himself in, that he lives in Monaco to make sure he pays absolutely no taxes whatever towards any of the causes that he espouses. He is now going to drive an all-black car and have an all-black team, and they will all wear all-black overalls. I mean, sorry. How can... This is cartoon. This isn't thinking. This is cartoon. If it weren't so dangerous. It's simply funny. The man should be a laughing stock. You should... Hamilton. But you mentioned a much more interesting word, scholarship. One of the things that's really striking is how problematic the scholarship behind, say, black history is, which again is one of the underliers. David Olusogo, who is an interesting and quite able young historian, has been one of those throwing his weight around in all of this. In the days when I sat on the Blue Plaque Committee in London, the thing that accords immortality with those rather elegantly designed, they're actually porcelain, blue and white porcelain set into the wall. In the days when it was serious and we properly scrutinized people whose names were going to appear, and we had a serious historian working for us whilst we did it, there was even then pressure to acknowledge blacks, be it Mary Seacole, be it Mary Price, be it Equiano, people like this. But whenever our historian got to work on them, for example, on Mary Seacole, we now have this enormous statue of her at St. Thomas's Hospital, completely overwhelming Florence Nightingale. And she's elevated. We actually named some of the emergency hospitals after her to set up alongside Florence Nightingale. Well, Mary Seacole was indeed. She was indeed at Scutari. She was indeed in the Crimea. But whilst Florence Nightingale was in the Crimea, desperately trying to manage a great hospital, desperately trying to reform nursing, anaesthesia, and the whole business of antiseptics, everything like that, what was Mary Seacole doing? She was running the officers' mess. She was keeping the officers supplied with alcohol, brandy, and cigars. That's what Mary Seacole was doing. And the attempt at seeing equivalence there is simply preposterous. Somebody like Mary Price, who's a quite interesting figure, and when we looked at her, we got quite excited about it. Here is a woman, black woman, 1 tick, 2 ticks, autobiography, 3 ticks. Then, of course, we discover that the autobiography is ghosted by a white woman. And as far as I can see, is at least half fiction. You see what I mean?
But if we list some of the things that Seacole is routinely described as, she's routinely described as a pioneer nurse, the first nurse practitioner, the original lady with the lamp, and a battlefield nurse who worked under fire. Are you dispelling those myths?
All of these things are complete rubbish. I mean, she's there. As I said, she's running the officers' mess. Even Olusegun actually says that. He admits that. So the whole of this movement, to erect statues to her, is utterly false. It's phony. It's the invention of the false past. Because again, there is this desperate claim to assert that we've always been racially diverse. It's not true. And of course, blacks in seaports. There were blacks in Henry VIII's navy. There's a famous black trumpeter. There's never been a more famous, non-famous person than somebody called John Blank. In other words, he's a very black, almost certainly Moorish North African, who was one of the Henry VIII's trumpeters. And of course, his real name is not Blank, it's Blanc. So he's called John White in French because he's very black. He's there as a kind of, and clearly a good trumpeter. He's there because he's a bit exotic and a bit different. The attempts at inventing a biography for this man, he is the first chapter in a splendid book by a fine young historian called Miranda Kaufman, and she goes through trying to find black people in Tudor England. You can find a few. Once you've found them, you can find out almost nothing about them. Mm-hmm. And what is striking, if you look at the chapters in that book, the first half of each chapter is written in italic. Why? Because it's a fiction. It's what probably might have been, could have been. If we, you draw on other examples, maybe it looked like that. Now, no, come on.
Well, that leads me on to a really important question then, because I'm not sure I should admit to this at risk of diving straight into sycophancy, but I imagine I learned a hell of a lot more from watching your documentaries over the years than I ever did in the state education system as far as history is concerned. But I wonder how long it might be, Dr. Starkey, before there are calls to remove even them, any trace of them from the internet. And in what light, if we think about in the context of these, of monument sacking, as it were, and we think about calls to decolonize the curriculum, what do you think is a good strategy to combat this as a historian? Because if we think about, there was one, you must have seen this, so a pretty good example of a BBC Horrible Histories sketch on Brexit Britain and our xenophobic history. Do our children stand a chance?
Taught by people like that? No. One is what has got to happen, and a central part of the problem is the failure of the conservative of the right to be as passionate about its beliefs as the left. And again, the whole of the Brexit vote, and particularly the general election result, the collapse of the Red Wall and its re-erection as a Blue Wall in the north of England. The fundamental thing is a basic elementary sense of patriotism. But that has almost become a vice which dare not speak its name. You know, the love of country is a love that dare not speak its name. Gay love now never shuts up, of course. But patriotism is ashamed, is silent, is suppressed. And what is so preposterous about this, Darren? How would I go about tackling it? I would say quite simply, you cannot decolonize the curriculum, because you, Black Lives Matter, are wholly and entirely a product of white colonization. You are not culturally black Africans. You would die in seconds if you were dumped back in black Africa, because you wouldn't know how to cope. You're a product yourselves of cultural and racial mix. And again, what is very remarkable about the pulling down of the statues, normally statues are pulled down, be it Hitler, be it the French kings in the time of the French Revolution, or indeed our own kings in the time of the Civil War, because people have been defeated. What has happened, of course, is that the only reason that these young black protesters are here, isn't it slavery? It's only because of the great African diaspora, the compulsory diaspora, because of slavery. What, of course, that brings you up to confronting is, of course, slavery was not the equivalent of the Holocaust. And again, there's no point in arguing against globalization or Western civilization. They are all products of it. We are all products of it. The honest teaching of the British Empire is to say, quite simply, it is the first key stage of world globalization. It's probably the most important moment in human history, and it is still with us. Its consequences are still on, and generally speaking, in most ways, actually fruitful. There are downsides, again, as the Brexit vote demonstrated. So that's how you go about tackling it. And as for the idea, as I said, that slavery is this kind of terrible disease that dare not speak its name, it only dare not speak its name, Darren, because we settled it nearly 200 years ago. We don't normally go on about the fact that Roman Catholics once upon a time didn't have the vote and weren't allowed to have their own churches, because we had Catholic emancipation. And you know what? We had Catholic emancipation at pretty much exactly the same time that we got rid of slavery in the 1830s. Mm-hmm. We don't go on about that because it's part of history. It's a question that's settled. Again, it's the point you made. It's American import. It's because, of course, in America, it took civil war to deal with the question of slavery. And even then, as part of the very, very imperfect settlement, as we know, slavery in the South was substituted for by a system of organized repression. Economic, social, and everything else in the form of segregation. But that's never been true in Britain. In other words, we're having a false history forced upon us.
What do you think explains that, though? Because you have, I've watched you speak about this in the past. You speak about the fact that in this country we have a very quiet patriotism, a very quiet but proud patriotism. But this strikes me that, and I'm not sure whether or not it's the loss of Christianity, it's the loss of faith in general, that we see almost religious style movements towards the National Health Service. We see religious style movements towards Extinction Rebellion. We see religious style movements toward the Black Lives Matter activism. What explains this, what I can only describe as a sort of crisis of confidence that seeks to delegitimize our history in order to try and import America's history to these shores?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is, I don't know whether you've ever read wicked old G.K. Chesterton. Now, there's somebody whose statue should be torn down. Marvellous, plump G.K. Chesterton, a sort of Catholic fascist, but wonderful poet. And he's got this amazing line. When people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. I think this is the key thing, that what we've seen is this enormous transfer of religious belief displacement, if you like, into other areas. And you've listed a few of them: Black Lives Matter, the environment. Oh, for God's sake. If you actually look at people like David Attenborough and the obvious Greta, these are like figures out of. Well, what they do, they really remind me of the life of Brian. One of their sketches, the Greta Thunberg she's exactly like a mad medieval child saint. The Middle Ages were filled with these bloody child saints, and the other extreme from the child saint is the incredibly mad, doddery, white-haired old man, David Attenborough, doom, doom, doom. And again, nature worship. It's nature worship, man bad, nature good, rewilding. We want more wolves. We want to see more human beings torn apart, by savage animals. So it's nature worship. It's environmentalism was one of the most obvious examples, because again, what all of these things seem to be about is a form of self-hatred. People don't really believe, do they, that we actually want to go back to the Middle Ages? But the idea that we are going to stop global emissions, stopping global emissions can only be achieved if we abandon industrialization. Industrialization is what is responsible for increased life expectancy. You don't live longer because you are virtuous. You really don't. You live longer because you are cleaner, because you are well fed, because you have heat in winter, you have cool in summer, and you have modern medicine and you have modern antibiotics. And all of those things, I'm afraid, are a product of wicked old industrialization and wicked old capitalism.
And the abolishment of the slave trade itself, you've argued, haven't you, that's partly responsible.
The only reason remember, again, this preposterous notion that Britain is singularly guilty, of course it's utterly silly. Every civilization before our own has essentially depended on slavery. The glories that were Greece, the splendor that was Rome, slavery. Every time Mary Beard gets up and waxes lyrical, she needs to tell us it was the slave what did it. Even the fine arts in Greece and Rome were the work of slaves. Everything, because there is no alternative. Everything is human physical labor. The great transformation in human history actually begins in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, and this is, we think of the Middle Ages as being much less sophisticated than Greece and Rome, which in many ways they were. But if you actually look at medieval Europe, it's astonishing engineering skill. You get the beginning of mechanical clocks, you have mechanical organs. You look at the technical skill of, say, an medieval cathedral, something like the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey. You look at the technical skill of that and you compare it with the architecture of Greece and Rome, which is basically just, concrete domes and pillars and beams, but the sheer complexity of building a fan vault. So you get one of the peculiarities of Western European civilization, on which industrialization builds, is this extraordinary technological sophistication. The quality of a sailing ship, of a late medieval, early modern sailing ship, compared with the magnificence of a Roman ship, the Quinquareme of Nineveh from distant Ophir and all that lot, just powered by lots and lots of slaves. Even before you get steam, we were able to use sail in a much more impressive and in a much more effective way. But it's industrialization that replaces slavery. It's no accident that the movement for abolition is late 18th century, exactly the moment that industrialization takes off. And we have to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, where do you think this actually ends, though, Dr. Starkey? Because if we allow this attack on our history, and many politicians, I think, seem intent on pandering to this. I mean, I should first of all say that I actually find the slogan "Black Lives Matter" entirely laudable, right? Who wouldn't? It's reasonable. Of course they matter, but it's the Marxist outfit behind that slogan that is fundraising to overthrow the state, that is fundraising to come up with strategies to abolish our police force. And just yesterday, actually, I saw a load of tweets from them saying that they want to free Palestine. What the hell has that got to do with Black Lives in the United Kingdom? So where does all of this end? If we think about all of the attacks on Sir Winston Churchill, on Drake, on Nelson, on Peel, on Gladstone, on Grey, is this an attempt, just a naked attempt, to delegitimize the whole, the entire, never mind the curriculum, but everything that Britain has ever stood for?
And indeed the West in general. I mean, that's the intention. I mean, that extraordinary woman, Gopal at Cambridge, says she wants to abolish whiteness. Abolish whiteness. That is her purpose. And to replace it with some kind of rainbow, black, gay, God only knows what else. It is, of course, an absurdity. It won't happen. Some very interesting opinion polls have just been done, and it shows that support for, you mentioned, taking down Churchill's statue, runs at 10%. 10%. I think eventually this will come up against the rock of that it's a narrow, mean-spirited, dangerous cause. It is, this is in a sense, it's a form of displacement activity. These people lost the referendum. They lost the last election. Again, extinction has faded out. They're used in their own lives. They're used, of course, in the bizarre world of Plato's cave of Twitter to ruling the roost, and they find it very difficult that because they all think it very important, because they all get together and make a snooty noise about it in London, that everybody else doesn't immediately bow down before them. Now, what the right has allowed to happen is universities and the educational system and the BBC and so on have indeed been penetrated and taken over. And indeed the police force. I mean, has there been anything more shocking than the sight of policemen going down on their knees before rioters? What is the symbolism of that? There is the French novel Soumission, Wiebeck's novel about the takeover of France by Muslim extremists. Submission, soumission. The going down on the knee is the most obvious gesture of submission. And when the forces of law and order kneel before the rioter, can one be surprised at what's happened? But this does not carry the basic political process. There is a Conservative government with a majority of 80. I think it's mistaken simply to largely ignore it. It is simply ignoring it. The demonstrations will continue until they piddle away. The thing that is alarming are the consequences for the future. As you said, the takeover of our educational system. What I'm hoping, let me tell you what I think should happen. I think that we should probably begin with the universities. I'm now going to say something that I would normally have bitten my tongue out. I think we should start with Cambridge. I think we should start with my own university. And we should say quite straightforwardly that no government funding, either directly in terms of actual funding or indirectly via fees, will be payable to, for example, the English faculty at Cambridge. Because the English faculty at Cambridge is not about academic freedom. There is no academic content in it whatever. What it is about indoctrination. It is a program of Marxist indoctrination dressed up in this preposterous American French, Franco-American language of critical theory. It is the worst form of perverse verbiage. There can be no public benefit for paying for anybody to do it. I wouldn't abolish it because I believe in freedom of speech. But if people want it, they bloody well pay for it themselves. And this seems to me to be the approach we have to take. We should defund the BBC. If the BBC wants to produce propaganda and people want to pay for it, fine. There's no reason why I should. And I suspect this will happen. That what the one thing the government does control, it controls the purse strings. And I think the purse strings will be probably sometimes quite subtly. I mean, the way in which the tourniquet has been applied to the BBC over the 75 license exemption is fascinating. I think we'll see many more examples of that.
Yes, I've got two questions from that then. I've got one question was, I don't know if you saw and by the way, I love Cambridge. I think it's one of the most phenomenal, fantastic places on planet Earth. And I think it's desperately sad to see what I would describe as rank hypocrisy from Cambridge University.
Oh, it's worse than hypocrisy. I mean, I weep. You know, I'm a product of it.
I can imagine. I don't know if you saw their defence of free speech for Dr. Gopal, but where, Dr. Starkey, was there robust defence of free speech when Jordan Peterson was hounded out of the university?
Or me.
Yeah, or you, indeed, yes.
Or me over the... I mean, I had that moment in 2015 when the Cambridge fundraising campaign was launched. If I had decided to make a fuss, I could have stopped it in its tracks. And out of loyalty to the university, and also, again, I talked about not wishing to do victimhood, that attack on me happened 3 weeks after James's death.
Wow.
Indeed, I had recorded the key episodes at Cambridge 2 days before his death, and the reason that I didn't see him alive was because I was doing an event at King's College the night before he died, and that was why I didn't get back and see him alive. So...
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, and if they can't stand up and defend their own, especially at a time like that, you know, all it is that matters. If we look at Cambridge University, if we look at the BBC, if we look at all of these institutions, they are just. We have the police force being told not to apply the law, to selectively apply the law. We have a university selectively applying their robust defence of free speech. And we have a Conservative government that, despite the fact that the polling you just mentioned, Policy Exchange found that 77% of Brits are vehemently opposed to any removal of our history and through monuments, etc. So I think at every opportunity, the state or organs of the state seem to be failing us.
I agree.
Is that too harsh? Am I being too harsh?
No, I don't think you're being harsh at all. I mean, I think that there's a new book just been published about the long march, you know, the long march through institutions, and the long march of the extreme left through institutions has happened in Britain. There's absolutely no doubt about this, whatever. It has to be said, to astonishingly little general effect on public opinion. And people don't want it, aren't interested, and dislike it. But they control the commanding heights. And there is an extraordinary weakness of response. I mean, part of the trouble has been, of course, that this terrible confusion of the word liberalism. You see, we were talking about my own former politics of which extreme form of liberalism, of libertarianism, and I've just come to the conclusion it doesn't work, and that instead, Edmund Burke's view of the organic nature of society, its rootedness in the past, the importance of gradualism of change, and particularly the importance of conserving institutions. These are the central things. But our political conservatism in this country really hardly exists as a serious political movement. I mean, we all think of Margaret Thatcher as somehow reasserting conservatism. She didn't. Margaret Thatcher reasserted liberal economics. And the late great Roger Scruton, Sir Roger Scruton, always points out that the relationship between capitalism and conservatism is by no means clear cut. I mean, there is one, but it's not absolutely straightforward. But what Thatcher did, she made conservatism purely an economic doctrine. And so you get somebody like Philip Hammond, a very good example of this, or George Osborne, who are absolutely high and dry liberal economists. That's to say, as far as possible, believe in austerity, balanced budgets, and all this kind of thing. But at the same time, personally, are let it all hang out liberal. And this is the great problem, that we do not have any significant political figure, and that's to say anybody holding elective office, who is able or willing. Some of the younger MPs certainly know about it, but none of them seem to be willing to articulate properly these ideas, the kind of thing that we've been talking about now. And we have had 10 years of a conservative-dominated coalition, plus Boris Johnson, but setting aside Theresa May, God knows, very easy to set Theresa May aside, whether any idea ever penetrated that strange sponge of the brain is unclear. It was certainly never articulated. But if you look at David Cameron on the one hand and look at Boris on the other, they are fundamentally soggy centralist liberals. And again, you look at what does Cameron do when he wants to emulate Tony Blair? He forces gay marriage on his party. I've been one of the most consistently out people in British public life, going right back to the days when it was actually quite difficult, when people like Ian McKellen were still very carefully in the closet. They only pop out when it's safe to do so under John Major, and then of course become leaders. But I was deeply dubious about gay marriage because although I long ago rejected Christianity, I take Christian beliefs seriously. And marriage has, certainly in Catholic Christianity, a sacramental function. There is an elaborate theology of it, of the relationship of man and woman, and so on and so on. And there's a kind of flagrant rubbing people's nose in something to assert gay marriage, because again most people have lost the sense of the Christian and the sacramental. It doesn't seem so outrageous, but if you take it seriously, it's very outrageous. So I thought what Cameron did was shocking and casual, but typical of this sort of easy gesture politics. And we've never had any hard gesture politics. We are at a stage where we need them. But again, Darren, we talk about this, you're very young and I'm quite old, we talk about this as though it was something new. Well, elements of it are new. But one of the things that's most striking is the fundamental self-hatred of the British intelligentsia. And it's identified brilliantly by George Orwell in the 1930s and 40s, particularly 40s, the great essay on the Lion and the Unicorn, in which he remarks that typical left-wingers would rather be seen stealing from a poor box in church than stand
Union Jack.
national anthem. Wonderful, always wonderful language. But it goes back much further. It goes back to the Oscar Wilde generation. It goes back to, in Gilbert and Sullivan, it's exactly the same. There's that wonderful moment in Coco's song in the Mikado, those on his little list, those who sing the praises of every country but this and every century but their own. It's peculiarly English. Well, not only English. It's also now become American. Americans have become white Americans become even more self-hating than we are. But the infection came from Britain. French intellectuals don't hate France. German intellectuals sort of hate bits of German history, but bloody dedicated to the German language. It's a peculiar English form of self-hatred, which is very closely associated with upper-class snobbery. It's all to do with the fact that the plebs drink beer, you, my dear, drink wine. And the more expensive and the more French and the more elaborately unpronounceable the chateau, the better. It's a form of snobbery. And it's, again, our conversation is going back full circle. It's, whiny madam. Excuse me.
It's really important to cover Sir Winston Churchill, you see, because the audience will be absolutely desperate for your take on it. But there are a lot of arguments put forward, the Owen Joneses of the world, the Ash Sarkers of the world, who argue that Sir Winston Churchill was a racist and belongs in a museum. What's your take?
Well, of course, Churchill had powerfully racist views. Everybody did. Virtually everybody did in the 1930s. I mean, if we're going to go on and going to start picking up people who had undesirable opinions in the 1930s, can I share a great confidence with you, Darren? The institution that I ornamented for 25 years of my career, LSE, is founded by eugenicists, right? The left is soaked in eugenicism absolutely up to its eyeballs. The LSE, the funding for its building came from three guesses who? Rockefeller. And what was the reason? It was because Beveridge and Rockefeller share an interest in eugenics. And there was a department of social biology, and it was said you couldn't walk up and down Hatton Street without retching with the stench of tortured rats in the basement. You know, come on. And Mary Stopes, now idolised for abortion and birth control and all the rest of it, believed passionately in the elimination of the disabled. She acclaims Hitler.
Wow.
As opposed to Churchill destroying Hitler, this goddess of liberated womanhood actually approves of Hitler because of his eugenic program, which finds its natural culmination in the concentration camps, where, remember, they only had the Jews quite late on, after they've got rid of the disabled, the gay, the gypsy, and all the rest of it. So Churchill is a man of his own time. And this, again, is the entire problem with the Black Lives Movement. It is what is so scandalous about people like David Olusoga, who are historians. It is the terrible, fundamental historical sin of anachronism, of reading the values of the present back into the past. If you do that, all human history just becomes an exercise in patronage, in complete cultural patronage. It reminds me, have you ever seen one of the more humiliating moments of my life, which was taking part in Jamie's Dream School? Oh, God, what a torment. Anyway, one of the thicker people in that came up to me to explain that he felt superior to St. Thomas More because he had better opinions. So I looked, this lad was barely capable of writing his name in English. So I said to him, how many languages do you think Thomas More writes? I don't know. Well, we know he is fluent in at least 3. That is to say, in English, French, and Latin. Indeed, his Latin is so good that he finds it easier, young man, to write in Latin than you do in English. He writes one of the world's great... we just continued like this. And even after about 10 minutes into this extremely dense and ill-furnished skull, with about 1.5 working synapses, the notion that because the opinions of now and Thomas More have the opinions of then. Thomas More, for heaven's sake, believes in torturing people to death. He believes in burning people alive because they are heretics, because they will corrupt the rest of society. That doesn't stop him of being a great man. The fact that Churchill thought that Indians were not capable of governing themselves properly. He turns out to be wrong, though the only reason they've been able to do it is because of the structures that were left by the British Raj. But Churchill again took the attitude in the famous famine that feeding Britain was more important than feeding India. Now, he is a war leader. He takes terrible decisions every day. This is not, deciding what shall we have on our cereal this morning? Are we going to have raspberries on our cereal, or are we going to have blueberries? These are the decisions of life and death that will determine whether you and your country survive or an evil dictatorship conquers you. You take very, very hard and brutal decisions. And Churchill took them, and his greatness was that he was able to take them. And again, it's going back again to what I was saying about Puritanism. It is this idea that And a wrong view on race is the equivalent of original sin. It's the sin of the Holy Ghost. If you are responsible for that, all of your achievements in the past, the present, or the future are negated, and you are to be cancelled. You are to be obliterated. This is a deranged attitude. One cannot construct human relations on this basis. We have to acknowledge that wonderful phrase of L.P. Hartley: the past is another country. They do things differently. They have different values. The only proper attitude as a historian is to respect those values. You don't substitute them for your own, though occasionally some people have. The Catholic fascination with the Middle Ages, Victorian fascination with the Middle Ages. But what you essentially do, you recognize that you're there to explore difference. What the Owen Joneses and other such shallow creatures want is to impose uniformity. They prattle perpetually about diversity. They want to make everything the same. They want to make the past the same as the present. They want to make everybody's opinions the same as theirs. They are the most absolute totalitarian, intolerant, dangerous people. And this fact simply has to be recognized, it has to be repeated, and it needs to be said loud and clear and whatever.
My final question, Dr. Starkey, we sort of highlighted earlier, actually we've highlighted it throughout this discussion. But to end, I wonder if you might reflect on how we conservatives might actually fight back against this. Is it just to ignore it, or with a biased state broadcaster, with an education system that we mentioned is infiltrated by Marxists, with conservative politicians that don't seem all that fussed about conserving anything? Do we stand a chance? People are looking at you, Dr. Starkey, for help and reassurance, to give them that optimism.
I do in my own little ways. I think what we've all got to do, and is why I admire you and what you're doing. We've just got to dare to speak out. I mean, what the Black Lives Matter, the Owen Joneses, the Laurie Pennies, and all the rest of this world is, they think they can impose silence on us. And they think they can shut us up, and they think they can make us go away. We mustn't be shut up. We mustn't be silenced. We mustn't go away. And to really bring the thing a full cycle, Darren, can I quote to you what I've been in many ways my real motto, my real working motto, going back to the very, very early days of Gay Lib. Wonderful slogan: better blatant than latent. We need to be blatant Tories. Tory blatancy. It's a good slogan, that. And I like the word blatant. We need to be blatant. In your face.
Loud and proud.
Loud, out and proud. Matthew Paris put it very nicely, that the difficulty wasn't coming out as gay, it was coming out as Tory. We've all got to come out and rub their noses in blue.
Beautifully put. We'll end it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Starkey, for giving up your time.
Thank you.
Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that relies on support from people like yourself who want us to continue producing our free-thinking, high-quality content. You can rest assured whatever you donate, big or small, will be put back into ensuring we win the battle of ideas. Thank you for your support.